They're among the most persecuted people in the world according to human rights organizations, but you probably haven't heard much about them. Myanmar's Rohingya. They're stateless, they're displaced, and they're quite possibly facing a genocide.
Mass gang rapes, killings, including of babies and young children.
Myanmar's Muslim ethnic minority has faced persecution for decades, and that persecution has only gotten worse since Myanmar's transition from a junta to a democracy. Hey guys, I'm Sana, this is AJ+, and today I want to talk about who the Rohingya are and how they became among the most persecuted people in the world. The Rohingya are a Muslim minority in the Buddhist majority country of Myanmar, which was previously known as Burma until a military junta changed the name in 1989. They're one of more than 100 ethnic groups in the country based in the western state of Rakhine. The story of these 1.1 million people begins with Myanmar's independence from British colonial rule in 1948. Now, the British colonial period in present-day Myanmar was pretty brutal. From 1824 to 1885, there were 3 Anglo-Burmese wars. Throughout these wars, the British would take more and more land from the Burmese kingdom. Eventually, the British took all of it and made it into a province of their biggest colony, India. Now, the British directly ruled over Burma, and they did it by getting rid of 2 vital institutions in Burmese society, the monarchy and the marriage between religion and the state. And this was a big deal. The separation of religion and state had a huge impact on Buddhist monks who relied on the monarchy for support. That and the disrespect shown by the British towards Burmese culture and Buddhist tradition pushed monks to be at the forefront of the movement for independence that had begun to take shape by the early 1900s. And the man responsible for actually creating the Burmese independence movement was Major General Aung San. He, by the way, is the father of present-day Myanmar's de facto civilian leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a former political prisoner and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Remember her name because she's pretty relevant to the story of the Rohingya, as I'll discuss in a bit. Now, after independence in 1948, the Union of Burma, as it was called, had a democratic government. But a military coup in 1962 would bring over a decade of democracy to an end. The military overthrew the democratically elected government and instituted junta rule that would last until 2011. Now, where do the Rohingya fit into all of this? Well, the government and much of the country's population consider the Rohingya migrants or Bengalis. They believe the group either migrated illegally from Bangladesh or came as refugees during the 1971 Bangladesh War for Independence. The thing is, many historians believe the Rohingya have been living in the Rakhine state since the 15th century. And the word Rohingya itself means those of Rohung. Rohung is the early Muslim name of Arakan, which is now known as the Rakhine state. But they're still not considered citizens. When the Union of Burma became independent in 1948, it instituted an exclusionary definition of citizenship. The country's constitution said only, quote, indigenous races of the land could be considered citizens. And while the country is home to 135 different legally recognized ethnicities, the Rohingya have never been and still aren't one of them. And the 1982 Myanmar Nationality Act made sure that the Rohingya wouldn't become citizens. Human rights groups and even the United Nations protested the act, which instituted 3 categories of citizens. It was specifically designed to deny the Rohingya citizenship. So Myanmar says the Rohingya aren't citizens and are actually from Bangladesh, but Bangladesh doesn't recognize the group either, leaving the Rohingya without a country. As Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, and others have noted, the Rohingya statelessness has denied them the most basic rights and protections. Their movement is restricted, violence against them is treated with impunity if not promoted, and their homes and villages are often razed or attacked. Now, in recent years, the group's vulnerability to mob and state violence has caught the attention of the international community. In 2011, military rule in Myanmar came to an official end as the country began to make political and economic reforms towards a democratic system. Part of those reforms included undoing certain censorship laws and allowing foreign journalists into the country with fewer restrictions. That meant more coverage, more access. There were also hopes that with the reforms, significant changes would come to Myanmar's abuse of not only political power, but human rights. But since the political reforms, the situation for the Rohingya has only worsened. There's a lot of evidence that the government and government-backed Buddhist groups have engaged in ethnic cleansing and even genocide. In 2012, some of the worst violence against the Rohingya and other Muslims broke out after the rape and murder of a Buddhist woman by 3 Muslim men. The violence led to nearly 280 dead as Buddhist Buddhist mobs ran through Rakhine to push the Rohingya out of the state. Eventually, about 125,000 Rohingya and other Muslims were forcibly displaced. Human Rights Watch accused the government of ethnically cleansing Muslims, that it orchestrated mob violence against them, and that it, quote, destroyed mosques, conducted violent mass arrests, and blocked aid to displaced Muslims. The report also accused the government of allowing mobs to kill civilians and of burying the dead in mass graves. Then, in 2015, the Al Jazeera Investigative Unit worked with the Yale Law School's Lowenstein Clinic in an investigation into whether Myanmar government was in fact committing genocide against the Rohingya. The 8-month investigation determined that there was in fact enough evidence to say yes, the government was engaged in a genocide. And violence against the Rohingya, by the way, hasn't stopped, despite more and more international attention and pressure on Myanmar. A February 2017 report released by the United Nations outlined the sort of, quote, devastating cruelty faced by the Rohingya since October 9, 2016, when another bout of sectarian violence erupted in Rakhine.
Mass gang rapes, killings, including of babies and young children, brutal beatings, disappearances, and other serious human rights violations by Myanmar security forces in a sealed-off area north of Mong Dao in northern Rakhine State have been detailed in the report that our team has put together.
As a result, tens of thousands of Rohingya have fled Myanmar, fled the violence, and fled the crushing 78% poverty rate that devastates Rakhine. Between 2012 and now, almost 170,000 Rohingya are believed to have fled to neighboring Bangladesh or taken to the water, being smuggled into countries like Thailand and Malaysia. Now, there was a belief for a little while that former political prisoner and leader of the democratic opposition, Aung San Suu Kyi, would be a sort of light from Myanmar. There was hope that she would take the same force she brought to resist the junta and push Myanmar towards major democratic changes. But the icon for the fight for democratic freedom has not only remained virtually silent on the Rohingya, she has even restricted UN access to investigate the conditions they live in and any allegations of ethnic cleansing and genocide. So it seems for now, despite more and more international attention being paid to the plight of the Rohingya, there's actually very little hope for any end to it.